I've been asked to share some thoughts about capital raising in mutuals, particularly in an Australian context. And I propose to do that in part by looking at what has been achieved to date and in part by looking forward to the challenges of the future. But before I do that, can I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, emerging and future. When people mention the acronym ICJ, I don't know what immediately springs into your mind. As a former lawyer, I immediately think of the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the Netherlands. A quick online search of acronymfinder.com reveals 8 other possibilities. Today I want to structure my thoughts around another version of that acronym, ICJ, and talk on identity, complacency and journey. Melina mentioned at least 2 of those themes. Identity. What does the world say about identity? There are undoubtedly many quotes you can find online. Let me restrict myself to 3 of them. The first from the novelist George Bernard Shaw. Life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. The second, from Mark Zuckerberg, who seems to have founded a prominent organisation in the recent decades. Think about what people are doing on Facebook today. They're keeping up with their friends and family, but they're also building on image and identity for themselves, which is, in a sense, their brand. They're connecting with the audience that they want to connect with. It's almost a disadvantage if you're not on it now. I thought about leaving out that last sentence, particularly because I'm not on Facebook. And my third quote from popular culture is a quote from Elastigirl in the movie The Incredibles. Your identity is your most valuable possession. Protect it. As Melina said, in March 2017, I was appointed by the then Treasurer, the Honourable Scott Morrison, to undertake a review of the March 2016 Senate Economic References Committee report on cooperatives, mutuals and member-owned firms, and the submissions which informed that report, as well as providing input into the government's response to the Senate report. It's no secret, because Scott Morrison has said so publicly, that he was unhappy with the initial government response to the report, and he saw my primary role, in fact, in writing the report, was to persuade Treasury and other arms of government that change was necessary. I was to be an agent provocateur with government. I also took the opportunity to play the same role with the sector to some extent, and that's what I want to continue to do today. My task then was not to consider all 17 recommendations of the Senate report, but to consider 3 particular recommendations relating to accessing capital. The 3 recommendations were to incorporate in legislation a definition of a mutual enterprise. The second was to encourage APRA to set a target date for the outcome of discussions that were then going on with the mutual sector on issues of capital raising, and bring those discussions to a timely conclusion, which they did in large part 2 days before I submitted my report. And thirdly, to examine proposals to amend the Corporations Act to provide mutuals with a mechanism to enable them to access a broader range of capital raising and investment opportunities. It was clear from the outset that the question of identity would be integral to my review. The Senate report had noted that they had repeatedly heard that the lack of a legal definition of mutuals was hampering their recognition and development. The mutual model is different, but currently the Corporations Act and its consequent regulatory framework does not take account of the features that differentiate the sector from other companies. Whilst that was true, if you will read the submissions to the Senate report and also the submissions to my review, the sector was not entirely clear about what a mutual was and what constituted the core characteristics of a mutual. Of course, as Melina mentioned, there was the strange situation that Part 5 of Schedule 4 of the Corporations Act regulated the demutualisation of mutual ADIs, but did not define what was a mutual. Demutualisation was registered without clarity about what was mutualisation. It was left to ASIC to fill the gap through RG 147. And whilst it is true that the primary purpose for a definition being inserted in the Corporations Act was practical, if you're going to provide an opportunity for mutuals to access capital raising, which was a different opportunity from what existed for other types of organisations, you at least need to clarify what a mutual was so you knew who could access the new framework, the ability to issue MCIs. But the case for defining mutual enterprise or a similar term was at least in part an argument for recognition of the separate legal identity of mutuals. Many submissions referred to the need to recognise the separate legal identity of mutuals. I want to quote from a submission by the BCCM. It was a quote that I included in my report. The very fact that mutual companies are not defined in law is indicative of a wider problem that the sector faces. It's not merely that the lack of recognition irritates mutuals, but rather this now has a real impact on the day-to-day business of mutuals. The lack of a definition amplifies problems that stem from a cultural view of what is not a normal company. It means that mutuals are not considered when other corporate rules are devised and implemented, and that there is a systematic bias against the sector. And I would add that mutuals are not considered when investment opportunities are considered by investors. In the course of the review, my attention was also drawn to the March 2012 report of the UK Ownership Commission entitled Plurality, Stewardship and Engagement. As I've been tasked by considering an Australian perspective on raising capital mutuals, I will paraphrase part of the executive summary from that review. The Australian private sector is dominated by a single company organisational form, namely for a Corporations Act company limited by shares. Whilst this form has many advantages that should be celebrated, it has become the default corporate organisational form for risk-taking investors, financiers, regulators and government, to an extent that reduces opportunities for other organisational forms to grow and prosper. Plurality of ownership forms should be viewed as an economic good in its own right, increasing both choice and the variety of corporate forms available for varying business models and their investors, while spreading risk more effectively. I am anxious that there is evidence that short-termism is increasing, making it harder for Australia to have strong organisations where long-termism is central to the business model. The regulatory and financial focus upon the Corporations Act company limited by shares hides the degree of ownership plurality that Australia already has. By failing to recognise alternative ownership forms as they do exist, policymakers fail to offer them supporting infrastructure that they need to grow. The challenge for the sector is to create a renewed focus on this diversity and the long-term benefits for stakeholders, risk-taking investors, financiers, regulators and government. Being defined in law was a crucial step on the path to the mutual sector being recognised more broadly. It was required not only to identify the key features of mutuals to determine which entities would be permitted to access capital raising and investment opportunities, but to achieve a range of other related benefits, and these are talked about at some length in my review. Ultimately, I found myself in agreement with the members of the Senate Economics Reference Committee. Agreeing with politicians is a difficult thing to come to grips with as a lawyer. But I recommended that the Corporations Act be amended to include a definition of a mutual company. This was a different term to that recommended in the Senate report, which was a mutual enterprise. And my report includes some commentary about terminology. Many of you know, the Mutual Reforms Act adopts a definition of a third term, a mutual entity. And the use of different terminology, in fact, is indicative of the confusion about what a mutual is that has existed. However, paramount in my view was that any definition be clear and concise. Any definition must produce greater certainty, not more uncertainty. There were lots of considerations about what the characteristics of a mutual were. The one member, one vote governance principle. The need for a corporate purpose that benefited members and customers in their interactions and transactions with the entity. What the economic relationship between members and the organisation should be. In the end, in the Treasury Laws Amendment Mutual Entities Act 2019, which, as Melina mentioned, we were all waiting with bated breath on the last day of Parliament to see if it would get enacted, adopted a simple definition of a mutual entity. So, the definition. A company registered under the Corporations Act is a mutual entity. The company's constitution provides that a person has no more than one vote at a general meeting of the company for each capacity in which the person is a member of the company. A recognition of the one member, one vote governance principle, but no other requirements. A clear and concise approach. However, having legal clarity about what characterises a mutual for the purpose of the Corporations Act is a crucial step, but only a first step. Much is still required to be done to enable mutuals to take advantage of the other changes brought in by the Mutual Reforms Act. An important next step is building the understanding of the investor and business communities about mutuals and their businesses. Some questions that could be asked, and it would be good for the sector to have good answers. What makes mutuals distinctive? How is the sector different from other business sectors? What are the drivers of mutual business models? What makes the sector attractive to investors? Why should I invest in mutual capital instruments? The identity challenge for the mutual sector is to maintain and create the identity you want going forward, to build an image and brand that supports this identity and protect that identity. This is important. Anyone who wants to issue MCIs is going to have to produce a disclosure document, whether it's a wholesale information memorandum or a prospectus. They're going to have to describe their sector. They're going to have to describe their business model. They're going to have to describe what makes them distinctive. And all of that would be greatly enhanced if there was a consistent view around the sector about some of the sector-wide questions, and if there were authoritative reports and documents available which could be referred to by people as they prepare those documents, rather than have lawyers go around and invent the wheel or reinvent the wheel. I noted with interest that S&P released a report earlier this week on the mutual sector, and it contains the type of information that the sector needs to gather and collate in one place for use by all. But it focuses on particular questions, and there is much else that needs to be done in the collection of data and statistics and information about the sector. There's an education program that needs to be undertaken. The identity needs to resonate not only with members and customers, the present, but both members, customers and investors in the new capital, the future. Another way of thinking about this question of identity is relationship management. Why should providers of capital invest in a mutual entity, and what relationship is needed to maintain their investment? This is not new. Any entity or a sector approaching the capital markets for the first time needs to devote the time and energy to the task. We've seen it with new innovations over the years and new markets. So, my first challenge is to address the identity and relationship management questions consistently and quickly. C, for complacency. So identity is not the only challenge. Many of the speakers and panels in this symposium will address other challenges, but I'd like to focus on one which will not be covered: the complacency of not engaging in the issues. Again, I have 3 quotes for you. The first one is from a man called Benjamin Mays. You may not have heard of Benjamin, but he was the teacher and lifelong mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King. The tragedy of life is often not in our failure, but rather in our complacency. Not in our doing too much, but rather in our doing too little. Not in our living above our ability, but rather in our living below our capacities. And so it seems appropriate to follow with a quote from his pupil, Martin Luther King. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. And my third quote from Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of General Electric: change before you have to. My first example of potential complacency, not participating in building the identity required for the sector to be able to access the capital raising opportunities created by the Mutual Reforms Act. Not participating in forums like this, not engaging in the debate, leaving it to others. I've had contact with the mutual sector for coming on 20 years. And it saddens me to say that many players in the sector would rather be followers, let somebody else do the hard yards and work out what's best, than being participants in the debate. I hope that is not what the next few years brings. I hope everybody engages in the debate. My second example relates to that engagement question. Not amending an entity's constitution to actually ensure it is a mutual entity as defined and can take advantage of these new opportunities. You may not have to amend your constitution, but you need to ask the question whether you do. Not taking advantage of the special procedure provided by the Mutual Reforms Act to enable you to issue mutual capital instruments, MCIs. You've got 36 months to take advantage of this special procedure. There are many issues relating to the terms and conditions of MCIs which have not yet been determined. The Mutual Reforms Act tells us some things. They must be fully paid, dividends must be non-cumulative, the rights can only be varied in certain circumstances. But there are many issues that aren't discussed in the legislation. Mutual entities will have the freedom to determine other things. Some examples. Will MCIs have more of the characteristics of ordinary shares, notwithstanding that capital growth is probably going to be a limited feature of the investor assessment? Or will they have more of the characteristics of fixed income hybrids? Or will we have both or multiple things on a spectrum? Will the terms and conditions of the first few issues create investor expectations for future issues? Will there be differences between the terms and conditions issued by mutual ADIs and those issued by non-mutual ADIs? What is the relationship between MCIs issued by ADIs and member equity interests as defined in APRA's prudential standards. Having an industry view on how these questions should be resolved, or at least having an industry discussion where you agree to disagree, is an important next step. My fourth example relates to the regulators. APRA and ASIC, possibly the Australian Securities Exchange, others, have an important role to play in developing what these instruments look like. Don't leave the discussion with them to whoever who is first in the queue and is going to issue the instruments first. Try and have an industry discussion. My report recommended both of them facilitate the issue of capital instruments by engaging in conversations with industry. It's important for industry to take advantage of that opportunity. I'm sure there are other issues where there is a danger of complacency in allowing others to set the agenda. You can't leave it to others. Do too little and contribute below your ability and capacity, you run the risk that the outcome will be poorer, may not suit your institution, and you may be left behind. Everyone can contribute to the debates which are still required to enable mutuals to efficiently and effectively raise capital. These contributions matter. Don't leave it to others. You'll be pleased to know that my third letter, J, is much shorter than the first two. I have a quote from Johann Goethe, the German dramatist and author. Whatever you do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius and power and magic in it. The enactment of the Mutuals Reform Act has been a long journey, but the destination has not been reached. But what is the destination? Issuing MCI is not the destination. Asking why you need to issue capital, what are you going to do with the money, is much more important than working out what the destination is. In broad terms, a vibrant, innovative sector providing distinctive products and services to their members and customers, returns to their investors, and value to all their other stakeholders. The mutual sector will need to be bold. Small changes will not make a significant difference. Be bold about thinking what you can do with the capital you raise. You don't raise capital for the sake of it. You raise it for a purpose. What bold things will we see the sector do in the next few years?